Hey there! So let's continue our discussion about various ways we can use to connect to a data lake. And so far I covered those methods in case of which we have no clue about who is trying to connect. Those were those no identity type of access from my diagram. But in many cases, we would like to know what service or who is actually connecting to our data. So today, let's talk about the first method, in case of which we will finally know who that person is. So that's the topic for today. Let's get started. Alright, so let's jump into this with identity section of methods we can use to connect to a data lake. And here we've got two methods. So let me write them down. But actually today I will talk about the first one, which is simply called RBAC. RBAC, which stands for Role-Based Access Control. And actually, during this course, you should already be familiar with this name, because when I was creating a key vault using default settings, it decided to use this method to connect or to grant access to our data stored in a key vault. And later I changed it to the older method that used access policies. But we'll get back to this RBAC area in case of key vault later on. Anyway, RBAC, Role-Based Access Control. So we've got something to do with roles. But what are those roles? So basically, in Azure, there are hundreds of various services. As a data engineer, you'll work with a subset of them, but still the number is quite big. And as you can imagine, each of those services, it has its own set of permissions that are valid only in scope of this service. So for example, in case of a virtual machine, we might have permissions to allow someone to start this VM, or to stop it, or to log it in as a regular user, or to log it in as an administrator. And if you multiply those various permissions by number of services, you'll get a huge number of different permissions you could use to grant someone access. And because this number is so big, what Microsoft did was to gather sets of permissions into something called roles, and the role, simply put, is a set of permissions that together they make a logical sense. For example, they combine all the permission that someone needs to perform some particular role. So that's it. So actually, let me start writing this down. So roles. Role. So as I said, a role, it is just a set of permissions. And I will show that in a second how it looks like. So we've got permission 1, permission 2, permission 3, and so on. There can be multiple permissions included into a single role. And that's how it works. And now, various services in Azure have their own dedicated roles. That makes sense in context of a given service. But apart from that, apart from those service-specific roles, we've got 3, let's call them general roles or generic ones. And I want to talk about them for a second. So we've got such roles as owner. And owner is a super powerful role, because this role is like a god. It grants admin permissions on a given resource. So this person who is granted the owner role can do absolutely everything. With a catch, and I will explain that in a second. Then the second of those general roles is called contributor. So contributor. This is also a very powerful role. It also can do basically everything with a given resource, like the owner. The only difference is that the contributor is not able to manage permissions. It's not able to grant or revoke permissions. So super powerful role with a catch again. And then the third role I want to talk about is a reader. And this one is pretty simple, as the name suggests. This role allows someone only to view a given resource, not to modify it, not to delete, not to update, only read. But again, with a catch. Alright, so let's jump into Azure portal and let me show you where we can find those roles and how do they look like. Alright, so I'm in Azure portal and I'm at the scope of my resource group, and basically every resource, and resource group is a resource, contains this access control tab, this IAM. It stands for Identity and Access Management, and that's the place where we can see those roles and assign them. So to see all roles that are available in Azure, just click on this roles blade, and here you will see a long list of various roles that are built into Azure, each of which contains a set of various permissions. So for example, here we've got some Azure Arc related roles. Then we've got some roles that make sense in a context of Azure Front Door. Then we've got some roles for Azure Kubernetes, and so on and so on. And at the top, you can see those 3 generic roles that are not specific to any service: this owner, contributor, and reader. And every role has a description that tries to help you understand what actually this role is doing. So for example, for contributor, you can see that it indeed grants full access to manage all resources, but does not allow you to assign roles in Azure RBAC and so on. So everything except for permissions. Now, this description might not be too detailed, and you might need to actually check what exact permissions are granted by a given role. And to do this, just click on this view link in details column. So let me check now the contributor role. And here you will see exactly what permissions are granted to this particular role. And here the list is huge. Take a look that right now the UI is showing only 500 permissions out of 16,000 ones. And they are split into different categories or types. And as you can see, this list is pretty huge, pretty long. So it might be really difficult for you just to scan all of this stuff. And in such cases, what I prefer to do is to switch to a JSON view of this role, which simply contains the definition. And as many other objects in Azure, the role is just a JSON file. And you are now familiar with JSON, you should be able to understand what this file contains. And the part that we are interested in is this permissions section. And actually, what we can see here is, first of all, this actions tab that right now has only an asterisk or a star, which means that this role, the contributor role, is able to do everything. This star, it expands basically to every permission out there. So it's a very convenient way of writing just everything without explicitly providing each value. But we know that the contributor is not allowed to manage permissions. So how to write this in a role? And to do this, we have this not actions section, which simply means, all right, this role is granted everything that was defined in the actions part, except for those. So in the not action step, we have those permissions that are not granted to this role that are related to granting permissions. So simply put, by combining these actions and non-actions sections, we can very easily define what permissions should be granted by a given role. And basically that's how it works. In the case of Azure, we've got a huge number of roles, but there might be a case when those predefined roles, they won't work in your case, because you might need a mix of those roles. So to make it work, you can create your own custom role. You will just need to create this JSON file and then list the permissions that make sense in your business case. Now, the very important thing to remember about roles is that they are additive. So what do I mean by this? So let's say that this is the set of permissions granted by the first role, by role 1. And we've got another role, let me call it role 2. Both of them were assigned to some person, and as a result, the effective permissions that the given principal will have is a union, is a combination of all those roles. So basically, it will be like this. So everything that is contained in the first or in the second role will be granted to the user. If you had yet another role granted like this, those permissions will also be included. And this behavior is different to the one that we saw in case of user-delegated SAS tokens, because here the effective permission was the intersection of the permissions granted by SAS token and permissions granted to the user who was creating the token. So it's a different behavior. But that's how it works. If you grant 3 roles to a person, then effectively he will have a combination of all those roles. Alright, so these were the roles, but the role by itself, it is not enough, because a role, it is just a definition. It's just a set of permissions that actually they don't do anything on their own. We need to have something else to make it work. And the first part that we'll need is basically a security principal. So we need to know to whom we want to assign a given role. So that's the second part of our puzzle. So we've got a security principal. So the role, it defines what we want to grant. Security principal, it defines to whom we want to grant those permissions. And now, what is the security principal? So it might be just a user account for me, for you, for some other colleague. So basically it is MS Entra ID user, your company account, and so on. Apart from that, because it's not a best practice to grant someone permissions explicitly, directly. The better way to do this is to use groups, just to have this additional layer between a role, between a role and the resource on which we want to grant the access. So later on, the management is easier. And to make it work, we can use groups. Something very similar that we did in the previous episode when we were playing with Key Vault. Next, we can grant a role to a managed identity. So it doesn't have to be a person. It also can be an identity of a service, like the identity of data factory. And we'll use this option a lot. And finally, what we could use is a service principal. And to keep it short, just think of a service principal like an identity for an application. That's it. Alright, so we know what we want to grant. We know to whom we want to grant the role. But there is one piece missing. Basically, a scope on which resource we want to grant the access. So scope is the third part. And all of these things together, they are needed to make the assignment, just to grant someone a role on some resource. And now, when we think about the scope, we should think about the hierarchy of resources in Azure. So it looks like this. Whenever we were creating some resource like a data factory, data lake, or some other stuff, actually, let me draw it. So let's say this is our data lake, or maybe it is a database, or maybe it is a data factory, or any type of resource. What we had to do was to put it into a logical container that in Azure is called simply a resource group. So this is a resource group. And obviously we can have multiple resource groups. They cannot overlap. A single resource cannot span multiple resource groups. But that's how it is designed. Now, those resource groups, they also have to be a part of some other object that is called simply a subscription. So this blue rectangle is our Azure subscription. And we can have multiple subscriptions if that's what we need to have, like subscription 2, 3, 4. Maybe we have one for dev, one for UAT, one for prod, or maybe we have subscription per business units. It depends. And then we can also organize our subscriptions into something called management groups, just to have a better hierarchy of our objects. So this purple rectangle, it is a management group. And we can have up to 5 levels inside the management group. But you can already see that we've got a hierarchy. So resource is a part of a resource group. Resource group is a part of a subscription, and subscription is a part of a management group. And now, when we are selecting a scope on which we want to grant a role to someone, we can choose any of those objects. We can choose a specific resource if that's what we want to have. We can choose a specific resource group, or a subscription, or a management group. So we have a full flexibility here. But the best part of it is that permissions are inherited. So let's say we grant someone the owner permission here on the subscription level, because maybe we want to grant someone a very powerful set of permissions. And what will actually happen is that those permissions, this owner role, it will be inherited by every resource group that is a part of this subscription. And then it will go even further, and basically it will be inherited by every resource that is a part of those resource groups, which makes management much easier, because we don't have to explicitly assign the role on every resource, and then we can have hundreds of them. We just need to set the role on a higher level, provided that we have a good hierarchy of our objects, that the logical structure is valid. But basically, that's it. So in case of role-based access control, we have those three parts. A role, which defines what we want to grant. We've got a security principle, which tells to whom we want to grant the role. And we've got a scope, which means on what resource or on what resources we want to grant the access. So actually, let's write down those most important parts about RBAC. So they are inherited, those roles assignments. And this is super cool stuff. Then I told you that we can grant them even for a particular resource. But actually, in our case, when we have a data lake or a storage account, this data lake, it has multiple containers, multiple directories, and then multiple files. So how granular can we be here? You should remember that in case of service and user delegated SAS tokens, we were able to set access at the level of a specific file. But in case of roles, it is not possible. We can be only granular to a level of a container. So we could grant someone, let's say, an owner role on this raw container. So it will be applied to everything that is inside this raw container, or to our standardized one, or to the public one. But role-based access control doesn't allow us to be more granular and set, let's say, a reader access only on the sales directory. No, the container is the lowest, the most detailed level we can use. So let's write it down, that those permissions are set up to container level. All right, and actually let's assign someone a role. But before we do this, let me explain those small asterisks next to this owner, contributor, and reader roles. So let me write something down. So we are working with a data lake, and data lake, it's just this glorified file folder that stores files. And what we'll usually do is to simply work with files, read and write them. So let's try to understand how those three roles work together with our data lake. So let's say that we've got let's create a table for a role, and we would like to check if a given role will be able to read a file or a blob or modify the file, create the file or edit it. So simply write blob, like so. And we've got those three roles that I've been talking about, like owner, then we've got a contributor, and the last one was reader. Like so. All right. And based on what I told you, that the owner is super powerful, can do absolutely everything, you might think that, all right, so owner should be able to read our files and write them. The same for contributor, because these two, they differ only by the possibility of granting access. In case of reader, he should be able to read the files, but not write them. So actually, let's verify whether this is true. So what I will do is to grant someone a contributor role on the whole resource group, and then we'll see how it looks like. All right, so again, I'm in Azure portal in my DP203 resource group, and to grant someone access, I will just switch to this role assignments tab, inside which I can see which roles were already assigned, and I will here simply add a new role assignment. And now you should remember that to make it work, we've got to have those three things defined, like a role, a scope, and a principal. Now, the scope is obvious here because I clicked on this add role in the scope of my resource group. So Azure will know that I want to grant someone a role for the whole resource group. And now I can see various roles that I could grant on the level or on the scope of my resource group. And I want to grant this super powerful contributor role, which is stored in this additional tab, just to indicate that, hey, this is a privileged role. So just think twice if you really want to do this. But yes, I want to do this stuff. I want to grant someone a contributor role, a super powerful one. Then I've got to indicate, all right, so we know that you want to grant a contributor role. We know that you want to do this on your resource group level, but now to whom you want to grant the access. And we've got to first define, is it going to be a user group or a service principal or a managed identity? And then we'll use this members option to choose which principals you have in mind. So in my case, I'll just grant access to my demo user. So I will break these best practices because I will grant the access explicitly, but for learning purposes, that might be okay. So I will leave it as it is because I want to use a user, and simply let's add a member. And I've got this demo user that I want to use. All right, so let's select it, and then let's assign this role. And within a minute or so, we should see that the demo user has been granted the contributor role on this resource. And because right now I'm in the context of a resource group, that's why it says this resource. Now, if we take a look at our storage account, which is a part of this resource group, you should see that it also contains this access control tab, inside which we can see who is granted what role in scope of this storage account. And here you can see that the demo user was granted a contributor role, but this permission, this role, is inherited from the resource group. It wasn't granted explicitly at this level, but because we granted it on the higher level, it was inherited. And that is simply a proof that this inheritance works. So that's how you can grant those roles and assign them. Then one more thing that is really nice is the possibility to check what access is granted to someone. So let's say I want to see, all right, what access this demo user has on my storage account. So I would switch to check access tab and use this check access button to check access that was granted to someone. And let me find my demo user, and it will check that yes, actually it is granted a contributor role on the resource group level. So that's how easy it is to check permissions granted to someone. If I would like to check my permissions, I would use this view my access button. That does the same thing, but this time I don't have to indicate for whom the access is to be checked because it knows that I want to check access for me. All right, so we know that this demo user was granted contributor role. And I told you that it is super powerful. So actually, let me switch to this user from my account, my demo user. So this is it. Right now I'm logged in as demo user. And actually, let's verify that indeed on the storage account, this demo user is granted contributor role. So again, I will go to Access Control tab and then view my access. Because right now I'm logged in as demo user, then it would show that yes, I am granted a contributor role. All right, so let's go to our files and let's start to browse them, just to prove that indeed this contributor role is allowed to read and write files. So I can see various containers, and let's go into a raw container, and here we've got various directories, various files. You've got this file1 CSV that we used previously in one of the previous episodes. And yes, I can see the content of the file, so I can read it. But was actually a role-based access control used in this case? Take a look here at the top. We've got that the authentication method that was used to access this data was based on the access key. And the access key is the method that doesn't use the identity. It gives full administrative access. So for sure, this contributor role was not used here. And to make sure that the RBAC will be applied, I will have to switch to Microsoft Entra account. So let's do this. And something strange, because it tells me that I don't have permissions to list the data. So let's switch back to the access key. It works. Let's switch back to my Microsoft Entra account, and it doesn't work. And sometimes this is expected behavior. I mean, sometimes it takes up to a few minutes for Azure to propagate those permissions. But actually, in this case, this is a valid, it is expected behavior. Because the contributor role, even though it is so powerful, it is not granted access to read or modify our data. What? But I told you that it is so powerful. Yes, that's true. But to understand this, I have to talk about two additional things, control plane and data plane, and explain what it does. So we've got control plane versus data plane. All right, so what are these? So basically, when we think about accessing our resources, we can define two layers of it. The first one, control plane or management plane, it is used simply to manage and configure our resources. So it is used to manage and configure. So for example, in case of storage account or data lake, it might be used to set various properties of our storage account. Like, do we want to have the access keys enabled? Do we want to allow for anonymous access? Various networking settings. All of this is about management. So control plane is about managing and configuring our resource, but not about accessing the data, because that's what data plane is used for. So data plane is used simply to access the data. And those two planes, they use different endpoints in Azure, and different set of permissions are used in both cases. All right, but what's the purpose of this split? So actually, it makes sense. In bigger companies, you might have different persons, different employees playing various roles. So you might have some administrators that are responsible for management of a given resource, for configuration, making sure that it is accessible. But maybe you don't want to grant them access to the data, because maybe it's so sensitive. But still they have to be able to perform their jobs. And the other way around as well. So maybe you have a data engineer who has to be able to get access to the data, but we don't want to grant them access to modify the configuration of our storage account, because it's not his responsibility. And that's why we've got this control plane and data plane, those two various things. And actually, those three roles that I was talking about, this owner, contributor, and reader, they are from the control plane, which by definition, it doesn't grant access to the data. So in all cases, they simply don't have access to the data. That's it. So we have to use a different set of roles to get access. And now, so which services have this split on control plane and data plane? So basically, those services that store data. So for example, storage account, it has this split. Key vault to get access to secrets, databases as well. And actually, if we go back to Azure portal, and let me switch back to my admin account, I will show you where in a role definition you can see this split. So let's go back to our role definition and let's take a look at the contributor role. That is super powerful. And actually here you can see this split on actions and data actions. So actions, so all of this stuff, it refers to a control plane, while data actions is about data plane. And as you can see, for contributor, it is empty. Contributor doesn't have, by default, any access for data. And you can see the same inside a JSON definition of our role. Basically, it's here, data actions and not data actions. And they work in the same way as actions and not actions. And all right, so what role or which roles should we use to get access to our data inside the data lake? And actually, we've got a set of roles that are about this data plane for the data lake or for a storage account. So let me start typing storage data. Oh, come on, storage blob data. Yeah, these are the ones. So we can see those three roles: storage blob data contributor, storage blob data owner, and storage blob data reader. And this storage blob data part, that's the important thing, because it indicates that yes, this is this data plane role. So actually, let's take a look at the definition of the storage blob data contributor role and see how it differs compared to a regular contributor role. So first of all, in the actions tab, in the control plane, the list is pretty short. But what is important is the data plane, the data actions stuff. That actually grants this role a permissions to read, write, and delete files. So that's the role that in many cases you would like to use to grant someone this read and write access to your data, this storage blob data contributor. If you want to grant someone a reader access or access to read files only without possibility to modify it, then you would have to use this storage blob data reader role. So actually, let's add those roles to our table to indicate that we have those separate set of roles for a data plane. So it is storage blob data contributor. And actually, let's grant this role on a resource group level to our data demo user, just to see whether it will work this time. So let me add a role assignment. storage blob data contributor, yes, that's the one, to our demo user. Yes, please assign it. All right, it will take a minute or two to propagate. And in the meantime, let's fill this table. So we've got storage blob data contributor, and for simplicity, let's add only a reader as well. So storage blob data reader role. All right. And now these two are the roles that are used in case of a data plane. So storage blob data contributor, it is able to read the data and write it. And storage blob data reader, it is able to read but not able to write. And as I said, in many cases, for data factory that is used to read and write, you would use this storage blob data contributor role, not the contributor one, because it is about a control plane. All right, but one more thing. So how it was possible that when I was logged in as a demo user who was granted the contributor role, how I was able to read the data? Well, Azure was smart enough to notice that I'm not granted any of those data plane roles, but I have the contributor role that is able to read the access key. So it did it under the hood. It used this access key authentication method just to display the data. So that's the case, right? And there's one more thing, is that, all right, so the owner, by default, it is not able to read the data because it's a control plane role, not a data plane one. But actually, owner is so powerful that he can grant himself this storage blob data contributor role, and then he will be able to get the access using RBAC. All right, so let's jump into Azure portal. Let's switch to my demo account, my demo user. And this time, when we go to our data lake, I should be able to get the access to my data by using role-based access control. So let's verify whether it works. So right now I'm still using the access key. So let's switch to Microsoft Entra, and it works, right? I'm authenticated using my Microsoft Entra account. It uses the RBAC. Because I'm granted the storage blob data contributor role, I can see all of this stuff. So I should be able to see the definition, see the content of our file, and I should be able to modify it as well. So that's the proof that the storage blob data contributor role, it really grants this data plane permissions. So actually, let's write it down that we have this split on a control plane and data plane. And it is very important to remember about this, because otherwise you might be surprised why the owner of the contributor doesn't have access to the data. So control plane versus data plane. All right, so we have this, and let's finally revisit our scenario. So let's say that we indeed have our wonderful data lake. So this is our data lake, and we've got a data factory from which we want to get access to a data lake. And so far, in previous episodes, we used either access keys or SAS tokens to get access. And to make it a little bit more secure, what we did was to store the access key or the token inside the key vault. But actually, now, when using role-based access control, we can get rid of key vault. We don't need it anymore. Why? Simply because we can use a role-based access control. So we know that ADF has its own managed identity that can be granted access on a data lake, and you can use RBAC. And the role that we would like to use in our case would be simply a storage blob data contributor, because it grants read and write access. And we could grant the access on the scope of the whole data lake or on a specific container if that's what we need. Now, to make it work, we could grant or we could assign this role directly to our managed identity, or to follow best practices, we could create a group inside Microsoft Entra, then add our managed identity to a group, and then use the group to grant the access. And actually, let's create this group. Let's follow best practices. So let me go to Entra ID and let's create a new group, because the one that we created previously, it has a name that it won't work well in our case because it is about key vault. So let's create a new group like data lake contributor, or whatever would make sense in your case. Now let me add myself as the owner, and let's add a managed identity of our data factory as the member. Alright, so the group has been created. Let's refresh the view. It should be displayed in a second, and there it is. We've got this data lake contributor group. Alright, and then what we'd have to do is to go to our storage account and grant the storage blob data contributor role to this group. But obviously I have to switch to a more powerful role, because the demo user is not able to set permissions. So I switched back to my admin account, and let's go to our data lake and let's here add the assignment. So we want to grant storage blob data contributor role on a group that was called data lake contributor role group, and let's assign it. All right, it might take a minute or two to propagate, but in the meantime, let's go to our data factory and let's create a new linked service to a data lake. So what we'll have to do is first of all switch authentication type from the account key to system assigned managed identity, because we no longer want to authenticate using this, let's be blunt, unsecure methods. Let's use the managed identity of a data factory. And please note that right now I don't have to provide any credentials, any password, or any key vault that would store any of those credentials, because Azure knows which managed identity is being used by this data factory, and that's enough. What we just need to do is to indicate which storage account, which data lake I want to connect to. And it was this table data lake demo. And let's verify if it works. And it worked, right? So that's the proof that this scenario simply works. And take a look how elegant, how simple this approach is. We don't have to use key vault in this case. We don't have to bother with any type of passwords. We don't have to think about expired secrets, we just indicate, hey, Azure, I want to use a managed identity of this data factory to connect to my data lake. And then on a data lake, I just need to make sure that the managed identity is granted sufficient access. And that's how it works. So to summarize, this role-based access control is really nice because, first of all, we finally know who is trying to connect. In our case, with Data Factory, we know that it was a data factory itself. We have this huge number of roles predefined that are built into Azure. If we want to create our own, that's fine. We can create a custom role. Inheritance works in the case of role-based access control, so it makes the management easier. In case of granting the access on a data lake, we can set it at the level of a container, not more granular, but in many cases this is sufficient. And you've got to remember about this split on a control plane and a data plane, because you've got different set of roles for each of those. Alright, but there is one bad thing with those roles. It's the granularity. What if you would like to grant access to a single directory or to a single file? We can't do this with roles. So in the next episode, I will talk about the final way which we can use to get access to our data lake. But we'll cover this next time. So thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.